People evolve over time. Now, I don't mean they grow extra fingers, I mean we change. Emotionally, spiritually, as I age, I've begun to like different things. Yeah. There was a time where if someone asked me if I liked country music, I would have probably audibly retched. And now I find myself listening to Waylon Jennings and Johnny Cash because I'll always wear black and I'll always be crazy, but my music taste changes every fucking week. When I was younger, if someone asked me what my political beliefs would have been, I'd have said Democrat. Then after a stint in the army, Republican. Now, I find myself somewhere in the middle of the two, trying to decipher reality from fiction, disgusted with everyone, wishing a giant fucking fireball would just take out the whole planet and have done with it. Burn it all down and start over. Sunrise, sunset. One thing that stayed pretty consistent are my RPG habits. See, as much as I may rail on people for playing RPGs one way, I'm guilty of it too. See, my childhood was a horror show. I grew up wanting to be a cop because I genuinely wanted to protect people from the same shit that happened in my childhood. For instance, I never wanted any child to see his mother get punched so hard that she fell through a glass table. That very same mother of mine convinced me to stay out of the police force and ironically convinced me to join the army. What the fuck? So as an effect of my inability to protect people in real life, I found myself taking to video games to get my fix of white knighting. After all, we play video games that have control over something. At least that's why I play. So yeah, in a fantasy RPG, I'm usually a noble fighter, a paladin, saving the world and wooing the damsels and all that shit. Being evil, however, was merely just a curiosity for me. I mostly played evil because I wanted to see those options and see if they ended in any significantly different way. Usually, I was disappointed. I mean, my choices, good or bad, usually came out to the same end. Usually, halfway through a playthrough, I'd give up on evil and just play the good way because it was just more interesting that way. They put more time and effort into the writing. It seemed more pleasing. There were less penalties. The game wasn't holding me back. I mean, even playing neutrally was more interesting than being a dickhead without motivation. So I didn't really get into evil playthroughs, They just weren't all that fun for me. That isn't until I started playing Tyranny. Tyranny is the first game I have ever played that made me feel good about being evil. It's the first game where I actively looked for the most evil thing I could do. How? I mean, how the hell did this game make me, a white knight, turn into Hitler? Well, let's dig in, shall we? Tyranny sets up both sides of this conflict in an interesting way, at least from a strategic standpoint. I mean, you got the elite disfavored raise and salt all conquered lands and put all survivors to the sword, because why leave survivors to either come back and take revenge or become a liability as slaves or prisoners? Nah, they just kill them all. While the Horde, or of the Scarlet Chorus, they recruit and enslave the conquered enemies, adding them to their ranks because why waste good cannon fodder? The strategy of the elite is to wipe out the enemy, and the Horde overwhelms and brainwashes. These are both highly effective ways to conquer lands, which have been used by kings and dictators, I know I'm being redundant, in the past. It's important to point this out because in most games, the motivation of the evil player is just not established. So instead of coming off as a self-centered but cunning and with a higher purpose type of guy, their motivations just come off as a guy being a dick, a self-centered sociopath. I mean, two-dimensional characters might be good in pixel art, but not in a story, yo. But look, with Tyranny, good and evil is framed in the only way that makes sense during war. That the only path to peace is through victory, and no one can know the peace of Kairos' utopia unless they bend knee to him. In a strange way, it justifies doing whatever's possible to end the war quickly, because the longer it stretches, the longer the suffering and the edicts, which I'll get into soon, continue. The character creation screen is great. They've simplified a great deal of things this time around. I mean, for instance, history is merely the background of your character. It doesn't offer any bonuses, but it comes up in dialogue. And depending on your background, you're granted certain insights. This is the way, in my opinion, to go about creating a player character for too long. We have seen companies take the approach of the blank slate, or in movies, the neutral mask. The character is a stand-in for the player. This may work for heroic deeds, but not with morally ambiguous and sometimes evil characters. When the character the player is playing becomes a stand-in for the player, a neutral mask, the player becomes responsible for doing the things that the character is doing because there is no separation between them and the virtual them. The player isn't playing a role anymore. They are playing an idealized version of themselves. Therefore, being evil in a game feels slimy because you feel like you're doing it, which is an interesting idea from a psychological standpoint, but it becomes the reason why most people don't play the evil way. Creating a history for your characters is making that person separate from you. They are their own person, shaped by their background and history, shaped by their experiences, which are different from yours. Primary expertise and secondary expertise is pretty simple, and it's a deceptively good way to create a classless system. But you are never tied down to any one expertise, and you can spread yourself over several different skill branches later if you choose. Everything you need to know is laid out well in this screen, and everything you might need more info on is given to you through tooltips. It's like pillars, but less vague. Also, did you notice that might no longer increases spell damage? Did you notice it? I mean, go on, take a look. Do you see it? Do you? Yeah, good job, guys. Now that feels right. And all this is great. But look, the Conquest Screen is where the magic happens. Now, I've been saying for a long time to coworkers and friends that RPGs need to let the player establish their past, because if your past is all about killing and mowing down people in battle, and you're famous for your ruthlessness, and don't you think that people who meet you would constantly doubt your motives, especially if they know your name? I mean, the way people react to you is so much more important than how you react to others, because how they react to you is a potential conflict which the player must puzzle out to overcome. But more importantly, it establishes the character to you, and instead of leaving you to start the game with a blank slate, or worse than that, an amnesiac, you have chosen a background for your character and are already aware of who he or she is. So it allows you to role play easier, because up front, we've established who this person is. I found myself making strategic decisions during Conquest so that it is how I played. I always thought about the decision both short term and long term, and when a game actually makes me stop to think about a choice I'm about to make, man, it's done something right. So let's look at what makes this screen so good. The game gives you a choice between two objectives, and you can only do one per playthrough, and a choice for each of these objectives for which army that you side with. Each army has a different tactic. So in the Infiltrate the Tiers objectives, for example, I had a choice of going in and attacking straight up with the elite disfavored and killing everyone, or conscripting the garrison into the chorus. Now to me, knowing nothing about the game and very little about the Archons and what they can do, I decided to wipe the garrison out with the disfavored, because to me, soldiers once loyal enough to fight against overwhelming odds, knowing they would die, have conviction strong enough to resist conscription. They would never turn against their beliefs. I decided they needed to die. In the next objective, containing the fire, I had a choice between allowing the Archon of the course to meet with the mages, and then they would disappear forever, right? And these are fire mages, and they were supposedly really powerful, right? Or I could trick them into a meeting and then ambush them with the disfavored, allowing them to be conscripted into the Scarlet Chorus. Now, I was conflicted over this for a while. I mulled over my choices for a few minutes. I mean, this description text stood out to me. The mages of the School of Wild Wrath were too barbaric to use their powers responsibly, so fire equals chaos. Sounds legit. I mean, I gambled and decided that not only would they provide a very sharp tip to the Scarlet Chorus's spear, but that their loyalties would be fluid. I decided to allow the disfavored to ambush them, and allowed them to be conscripted into the Scarlet Chorus. Yeah, I decided to let them live because they were too valuable a resource to let go to waste. At this point, I knew who my character was. He was lawful neutral, a strategist, Sun Tzu, willing to do whatever it took to win and end the war. The rest of my decisions followed suit. Why was I, the paladin of light and truth, so willing to be callous and hard in the face of moral choices? Well, it's mainly because the game did not give you any clear good choices. I mean, like Major Foster said in March or Die, I'm afraid there are no heroes in war, only survivors. Everything was done to win the war because when you serve a god that can create unending cataclysms with simple words, you tend to bend to his will. But also there's a sort of morality to ending the war quickly. I mean, the quicker the war ends, the less people die. The quicker things can go back to normal, or as normal as it can be in a dictatorship. This moral ambiguity is what freed me up to make sometimes heinous choices, because the alternatives didn't seem like the best strategy for ending the war. And this is the main difference between the way Tyranny does evil and the way most other games do evil. In Tyranny, it's believable. It's the best of a bad situation kind of deal, and you never find yourself regretting a decision, at least I didn't, because it was done with good intentions. I mean, never did I feel like Snidely Whiplash, twirling my mustache as I try to get those pesky heroes. Nah, Tyranny goes with the philosophy of the bad guy doesn't think he's the bad guy. And by God, it fucking works! So you might be saying, that's really not enough for me to behave like that. Okay. Just remember that, Germans were, God-fearing good people who loved each other, and they lived in harmony with Jews for years until Hitler came along. So just remember that, all right? But anyway, just remember that I said that Kairos was able to proclaim edicts that cause unending natural disasters. Okay, well, during a stalemate on the battlefield, Kairos sends you with an edict. Either crush the Oathbreakers or die. This affects you, the Archons, their armies, and literally everyone in the valley. Civilians and soldiers alike. You have only 8 days to fulfill this edict. If that doesn't light a fire under your ass to do whatever it takes to end the battle,
crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and hear the lamentation of your women. That is good.
The game never lets you forget about the things you have done either. It is constantly reminding you of events you took part in by highlighting conversations in green with tooltips, and they explain in detail the choices you made and how they affect the game world. This is one of the greatest role-playing mechanics I have seen in a very long time, man. I cannot gush about this enough.
Sploosh!
It helps you role-play the character to be immersed in the situation, as you have access to the same info that your character does and everyone around you does, and it helps inform the decisions you make in the future. I found myself constantly asking, would Rickard and Piri do this? Would Rickard do this in this situation? Would Rickard get pissed off when confronted like this? Does Rickard have a fragile ego? I felt for the first time in a long time that I was actually playing a role. It was an amazing feeling. I mean, in most other RPGs, especially newer ones, I find myself feeling like I am the character. Which could be good, I guess, but in Tyranny, there's this layer of separation. I wasn't playing me, I was playing a character that had his own motivations and needs, This layer of separation allowed me to make decisions on my character's behalf that freed me up from being culpable for the things that he did, because the character was not a neutral mass that was standing in for me, but was instead his own person. Now, I chalk this up to the fact that my character had a background, and even though I chose that background, he was still his own person. I just created him that way. So think about this. If the player is not the character, and all he is doing is creating him and moving him around the map to do things, are you actually playing as the character? Or are you, the player, Kairos? Mind blown. To further concrete this philosophy of making the best of a bad situation, you are forced, often, to make a choice between killing captives or allowing the captives to be conscripted as soldiers. The answer might seem obvious: allow them to live, right? At least they can have a chance to live through everything. The only problem is, the conscripts are often used sometimes as little more than fodder to throw against an enemy as a diversion. To make things worse, the elite disfavored point out, rightly so, the conscripts always end up escaping during patrol and they end up fighting the same people again on the battlefield. The conflict in choice is set up so well that you are either forced to reason the argument out for both choices and pick the best outcome on a case-by-case basis. It forces you, the player, to think these decisions through from a roleplay standpoint. Again, would your character want to take the chance of allowing these people to fight against you again, or does your character believe that the captive's potential strength would be better put to work than to waste in a grave? It may seem like a binary choice, but each choice affects something down the road. So for instance, I decided to let Tarkus Demos live and be conscripted into the Scarlet Chorus. Let's see if that has an effect down the line, shall we? Now later on we meet Ebb. We find out that Tarkus's fate has not only an effect on the dialogue options with her, but also on her loyalty and how she responds to you. I've yet to see if his recruitment has any longer term effects, but this conversation gives the decisions I make later on in the game that much more weight, because it has an effect on other things later in the game. To further enforce this freedom of choice, the wrath and favor systems for each faction gives you rewards for achieving a certain rank in either category. This gives you the freedom to side with, turn against, and behave whatever way you want, because the game is not trying to hold you back. In most games, the choice to be good or evil is really a non-choice, because they usually penalize you for making the evil choice in some way. Sometimes it's subtle, like with BioWare games. You know, for going to the dark side in KOTOR, your character aura changes, but you gain access to certain dark side powers, but they penalize you by making a light side powers like heal almost 3 times as expensive to cast than if you went 100% light side, which is, well, alright, it's fucking heal. It's kind of an important skill to have. So in the case of KOTOR, you'll be making your role-playing choices not based on your character, not based on how you want to roleplay them, but on your playstyle or build. Same thing going on in Mass Effect, except to a little lesser of an extent. Of course, you could just ignore all this negative reinforcement and just roleplay the way you want, but the point is, the game is encouraging you to play a certain way that has nothing to do with roleplaying. For another example, look at the non-choices in BioShock. I mean, choosing whether or not to harvest the child or rescue them is not a real choice, because the choice is killing a child and getting a tiny bit more Adam, or rescuing a child, getting less Adam up front, but more in the long run. Man, that's a non-choice, okay? No one wants to do that unless they're just trying to be a dick. And Tyranny doesn't do a morality system. The system at play here is more like an influence system. You gain wrath and favor with factions, and as I already said, both give you bonuses. And the other thing they do here is if you gain wrath, it doesn't necessarily take away favor. In KOTOR, when you gain light side points, you lose dark side points. And if you're a dark sider, that would also influence your decisions in dialogue. So you couldn't be both light side and dark side. You couldn't be a gray knight. You had to either be a dark knight or a light knight. Yay! There's yet another system for the followers as well. See, in Tyranny, you don't always have to be nice to your followers. You know, in other games, you're always trying to suck up to them. Even if they want you to do things that you don't want to do, you end up doing them because you don't want to piss off your other, members of your group. In some games like Baldur's Gate, there's a risk that you could piss someone off so bad that they end up leaving your team. With Tyranny, the genius of their system is that no matter how you treat your followers, they will still follow you. And whether you inspire fear or loyalty, you still gain a skill in either category. Again, one doesn't take away from the other so that you can pursue both. Okay, now though certain actions can make you lose favor with factions or lose loyalty with your companions, but in general, it seems much easier to gain without losing, as one doesn't necessarily drive the other. The point is, other games typically discourage you from pursuing evil actions. In Tyranny, it allows you to do whatever you think is appropriate for your character, and that's refreshing. Another thing is, there's just something about this story that allows you to justify what you're doing, and I believe I know what it is. If you take all the points I've made here and add them up all together, what you get is a biblical story. That's right, it's biblical. You're given the edict to perform yourself, so you are quite literally the harbinger of Kairos' doom. See, Kairos is Old Testament God. It's real Wrath of God type stuff.
Fire and brimstone coming down from the sky. Rivers and seas boiling.
40 years of darkness, earthquakes, volcanoes.
The dead rising from the grave. Human sacrifice, dogs and cats living together. Mass hysteria. Enough, I get the point.
You're out there passing out edicts, demanding loyalty, then destroying any who dare deny his power, or guys who just decide to pull out their, dick and spill their seed fucking their brother's wife. Yeah, that's in the Bible, bruh. Look it up. When men are confronted by the awesome power of an almighty God and see that the only way to live is to comply, nearly any terrible act can be justified. It's how the Canaanites were genocidally murdered. You could draw a lot of comparisons between God and a dictator. To quote from Samuel, I have noted what Amalek did to Israel in opposing them on the way when they came up from out of Egypt. Now go and strike Amalek and devote to destruction all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and women and child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. The people have seen what God can do, know what God does to his betrayers. An edict proclaimed is an edict obeyed. The Canaanites were slaughtered in the name of God, and the atrocity was permissible because it was proclaimed by him with a capital H. Perhaps this is all just cleverly designed to be this way from a game logic standpoint. Obviously, in war, there's very little in the way of good choices. Even though the game gives you the ability to spare people, even let civilians leave without conscription. There are times when you can be moral, but those choices just don't seem as enticing as the others. I mean, there's something about the power trip of this game. That infinite amount of power that you seem to gain and how you become more powerful as the game goes on. This could all just be chalked up to the fact that there's no immediate penalty for being a bad guy. I mean, perhaps it is just good design, or perhaps we're subconsciously aware that we cannot defy a god. Either way, the game did evil right, and I sincerely hope developers take notice of this game. Evil is not just vindictive or chaotic. Sometimes it's lazy, slovenly, willing to do whatever it takes to get to the moral center, even if it means harming the innocent. Not to mention, sometimes it's just fun to fuck with people. What's the old expression, you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs? This has been a rant from Strat-Edgy, and now that you heard it, go play some video games.